Hi everyone, my name is Joanna Christodolou. Thank you so much for having this event organized, and to my previous speaker setting up this topic of educational outcomes. I'm a reading researcher. I study the brain and behavioral correlates of reading development and reading difficulties. I want to share with you some of the work we've done with this community here, thanks in large part by many of the parents who brought their children to work with us in previous visits and in this one. So, the reading brain is largely reliant on the language brain, and the language brain is largely on the left hemisphere. The right hemisphere is incredibly important also in ways that we don't usually focus on, and I won't focus on for this moment, but I usually think of the right hemisphere supporting language in terms of the artistry of language, sarcasm, humor, prosody, all the ways in which we give the spice of life to how we express ourselves. But the left hemisphere is so crucial to things that are very concrete for reading, like decoding a word or recognizing your own written name. So all the ways in which we harness the left hemisphere are really critical for the reading brain. But of course, in this community, we care so much about thinking a single hemisphere, especially one that is the right hemisphere. How is it possible to read, and what is possible after surgery? As a reading researcher, we often think about the most common theory in reading to explain reading outcomes, and it's appropriately called the simple view of reading. It's the most well-known theory in the reading world, and it simply explains reading as the important integration of skills in your language domain and in the word recognition domain. And as each of them become more fluent and more automatic, you're able to become a comprehending reader because you're able to integrate them together. And the whole goal of reading is to understand. So in order to understand which of our kids are reading and why or why not, it's really important to think about all of the strands that go into that process. Of course, we know too that all of this is possible because of the integration with executive function skills. So the wraparound of you have skills is really driving the story as much as the core skills in the reading story. So in that way, I want to share some of the work we've done with this population, and also during this particular conference, we're actually conducting work with any families that want to participate, looking at reading and math and executive function. Our goal is to have a package of skills understood better so that when parents walk back into a school and children are medically okay and they're looking forward to their education, coming back online as the focus, they have tools to understand the potential and the pathways to success. So what you're seeing here is a bar. Each bar represents a separate person, and one of our early studies looked at individuals who only had a right hemisphere remaining. Part of our motivation was to think about, given our understanding of the left hemisphere being so crucial for reading and language, what's possible if you don't have that and you only have the right hemisphere? So we separated out our data by those who had early and late brain insults that resulted in the surgery. And what you can see, and on average, our population was about 15 years old, plus or minus about 5 years old. So the green line that's going across is where the average range starts. So that line and everything above it is in the average range based on a typical normed sample, and each individual here is represented. And on average, if we think about, first of all, is it possible to be a reader with a hemisphere that is not the dominant hemisphere for supporting that skill? The excellent, amazing, fantastic answer is yes. Does it depend on when you had the brain insult? On average, yes. And I think a theme that's consistent across everyone's presentations is that averages can be extremely informative, but each of us actually is more interested in the variability because there's so much variability among this population, and that's what we want to harness to understand and predict outcomes. So on average, while word reading is a skill that comes back or that can be acquired, on average, about 35% of the population is performing average range or higher, with the remaining below that. And that's just the average in the purple bar for the early and for the late insult. We have this sort of data on many measures, but just for time's interest, I'll share with you reading comprehension as a measure of contrast. Word reading is our first goal, and it takes foundational skills to get there. But the second goal and the ultimate goal of reading is to have children understanding what they're reading. Given how much more complex a skill this is, it's harder to achieve that, and it's going to take more efforts to think about what it'll take. And it's not just getting kids to decode, but it's going to be more about building the infrastructure of what reading takes. And we'll remind ourselves that the ropes that are integrated over time are what we have to think about at the systemic level of language and literacy as they come together. So here, what I'm just highlighting is for all of the measures we gave with this population, and that includes vocabulary, reading real words and made-up words in timed and untimed contexts, and reading comprehension. Each of these lines is a different person, and you can see the kind of variability across individuals, and it's separated out by those who had early versus late insult, and you can see why those scores are a bit elevated for early and are a bit lower for the late cases. And that brings us to the silver lining in the story, which is with the hemisphere, regardless of when the insult happened, our right hemisphere has the potential to build up the capacity for one of the most important skills we can empower people with, which is their literacy, which is on the literacy side. Now, to extend that thinking, another effort we put together was to think about how performance for children who have undergone hemispherectomy compared to another population that we think a lot about, those with dyslexia. Dyslexia is a developmental disability, and it specifically entails difficulty at the single word level. That means difficulty with the accuracy and or fluency of single word reading. And so we had populations matched on age and other features. Those with dyslexia are in red, and those with hemispherectomy are in blue. And I want to highlight something that's very incredible from our perspective. We gave measures of reading that were timed and others that were untimed. And on the measures that were timed, those who had undergone hemispherectomy were performing comparably to those with dyslexia. And on top of that, the trend shows that those children with hemispherectomy actually, based on standard scores, have higher scores for timed performance than untimed performance. Remember, again, this is exclusively for children who only have a right hemisphere, and I hope to plant the seed that might introduce some ideas about intervention approaches that are tailored to kids based on left or right hemispherectomy and the reasoning, their approaches to reading. And I'll just plug a little bit to say, if we think about the left hemisphere as being more trees rather than forest in terms of its analytic approach, and the right hemisphere being more forest than trees for its analytic approach, then you might think that a whole training children with strategies that are more whole word recognition and whole unit recognition and symbolic recognition for those who only have a right hemisphere remaining may serve an advantage, as we're potentially interpreting from what we've found so far. That data I just showed you, we can expand it to actually show that average matched performance actually is different depending on if we're thinking about those who've had early or late insults. So that feature is incredibly important to consider how they're doing and why. Okay, so the other study that we did was to actually include children who had only a left hemisphere or only a right hemisphere across similar measures in the literacy domain. And again, here we can see the individual differences based on which hemisphere they had removed. Across the board, again, I just want to highlight how important this variability story is and how important it will be to use this information to be able to predict what kind of performance kids will have and why. Because this highlights for us that, first of all, left hemisphere functions, if you only have a left hemisphere, as you would predict, that tends to have higher scores on language-related skills. And for children who have only the right hemisphere, we have found an advantage for skills that do not rely on language. Also, while functional skills overall show impairment compared to the norm sample, there is incredible resiliency following this surgery and incredible potential for accelerating that success with a coordinated effort across all the stakeholders who are involved. And I would love to continue talking at the later sessions about how in IEP sessions or in speaking with school consultants or stakeholders is incredibly important to understand for each child where their strengths are, where their weaknesses are, not just relative to standard scores, but relative to their own profile. So for a particular child, where are they showing areas that they can be harnessed and built on? Where are they showing areas of deficit? And that's where an educational plan that differentiates compensation versus remediation would be really important. Just to highlight that a little bit, that means in education, whenever we're working with children who have special needs, we're either trying to work around a difficulty, and we think of that as compensation, or we're thinking about trying to directly fix a challenge, an area of deficit, and that's remediation. And I think for this population that we're all here for in particular, differentiating when are we trying to just strengthen something that's weak versus give kids strategies to get around them will be an important focus. Okay, so I think I really want to pick up the ball where people in the operating room put it. When the job is done medically, or at least when there's medical stability, you're moving from the operating room to the classroom, and I think there's so much more we can do there to support this community. I think moving beyond the reading story, as others have done, and as we'd like to continue doing, into the other areas that are important for education, including math and executive functions, including the data collection from this session, will be incredibly helpful. I also want to say that understanding a child not just as a reader, but as a student more globally will have huge impacts for how to support them, because a reader is also a thinker, and integrating our experiences with those who do neuropsychs, those who are in schools who do math, will be important for thinking of a child from the whole child, more integrated approach. The most important question that my research team tries to think about is, for whom should we do what? So when we think about interventions, we want to answer questions that get us beyond averages to think about who's responding and why, and what the dosage should be, what the frequency and the duration should be of that particular intervention. Many people have already mentioned the relevance of pre-surgery measurement for establishing baselines where it makes sense, and partnering with all the stakeholders for more of a 360 perspective on children and the potential for their success in school settings is an exciting next step. Okay, that's where I'll pause. Thank you.